She had filled out the form the way she always filled out forms. Carefully, accurately, every box completed, every field answered in the clean block print of someone trained to produce legible records under difficult conditions. The intake nurse looked at her and said, "This section here, prior service, you left it blank." She hadn't left it blank. She had written exactly what was true. The nurse looked at it again and said, "I think there may be a system error. This classification doesn't match your file." She said there was no error. The nurse smiled the smile of someone managing a patient they've decided is confused and moved on. 20 minutes later, the Admiral walked into the examination room. He stopped when he saw her arms, and the room changed entirely. The appointment had been scheduled for 3 weeks. Not urgently, a routine annual physical, the kind required for continued medical clearance in any position that touches operational environments, even in the limited way that my current position touched them. I had been working as a medical liaison at the Naval Medical Research Center in Bethesda for 14 months. The role was administrative by classification, though the word administrative understates what it actually involved. I was the interface between the center's clinical research teams and the operational units whose injury and recovery data formed the basis of the research. I reviewed case files, I attended briefings, I translated between clinical language and operational language in both directions. It was work that required both vocabularies, and I had both. The physical was at a standard military medical clinic about 2 miles from the center. Nothing specialized. Routine clearance for personnel working in advisory and liaison roles, blood work, vitals, mobility assessment, review of any changes since the prior year. I had done it 8 times before. It took about 90 minutes, produced a form, and went into my file. I am 36 years old. I have been in the Navy for 13 years. I need to be precise about my background because the incident I am describing cannot be fully understood without it, and because the way the incident unfolded was a direct function of the specific gap between what I looked like in that clinic and what I actually was. I spent 6 years as a hospital corpsman attached to various special operations elements. This is an assignment that exists, that is not widely publicized, and that requires a specific combination of medical training and operational qualification that takes longer to develop than most people in standard medical career tracks encounter. I will not detail the specifics of my deployment history or the units I was attached to. What I will say is that the work involved functioning in environments where the gap between a correct medical decision and an incorrect one was measured in minutes, and the minutes were not always available. I left that assignment 14 months ago, not because I was removed from it, but because a combination of factors. A knee reconstruction that required 8 months of recovery, a family consideration that I will not elaborate on here, and an honest assessment of the sustainability of the tempo I had been maintaining, led me to request a transfer to a role that was closer to home and lower on the operational intensity scale. The liaison position was a good fit. The work was real. I was useful in ways I could measure. I slept in the same place most nights, which was new. What I was not in that clinic on that Tuesday morning was visible. I mean that in the specific sense. When I walked in, I was a woman in civilian clothes. The clinic did not require uniform for this category of appointment, with a name on a form and a clearance category that the intake system had apparently not correctly propagated from the prior records. I was of average height. I did not look like what I had been, which is typically true of people who have spent years in environments that specifically train you not to look like what you are. The intake nurse was efficient and pleasant, and had a practiced quality that comes from processing many patients in a day. She looked at my intake form, noted the apparent discrepancy in my prior service classification, and made the decision, quickly, with the professional certainty of someone who has resolved similar discrepancies before, that the system had generated an error. I told her it had not. She gave me a form to review while she consulted the administrative record. I reviewed the form. I had been in situations significantly more uncomfortable than this one. I had been in situations where the uncomfortable thing had teeth. This was bureaucratic friction, familiar in a different form, and I did not find it distressing. I found it accurate. The administrative world and the operational world are 2 different worlds, and the administrative world does not always know the operational world exists in the specific form that it does, and the people who move between them spend a certain amount of time in intake waiting rooms being looked at with the polite confusion of people who are expecting a standard form and receiving something that doesn't fit it. I was used to that. What I was not expecting was the Admiral. The examination room was standard. Paper-covered table, wall-mounted blood pressure cuff, the persistent antiseptic quality of a room that processes many people and is cleaned between them. A window with the blind drawn to the position that provides privacy without full darkness. A chair in the corner that seemed to exist as an afterthought. I had been waiting for 11 minutes when the physician assistant came in. She was in her early 30s, competent-looking, with the specific efficiency of someone who has a full schedule and manages it by moving quickly through the parts that are routine. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Marsh, not warmly, not coldly, but in the professional way of someone whose time is organized and who respects yours by not wasting it. She pulled up the record on the wall-mounted screen. She looked at it. She looked at me. She looked at the record again. The specific quality of that sequence, the double take with the professional overlay, is something I recognize. I have seen it before in this form and in other forms. It is the look of a person whose prior expectation and present information are producing a mismatch that they are politely trying to process. Your record shows a prior seal attachment, she said, not a statement, not quite a question. That's correct, I said. She looked at me with the expression of someone who is managing several conflicting pieces of information simultaneously and has chosen professionalism as the mechanism for that management. The classification in the system is, she stopped. I want to make sure we have the right file. The file is right, I said. She nodded in the way that people nod when they are not fully nodding. I'll just confirm the background information before we begin, she said. She asked me the intake questions. Standard ones, current medications, recent injuries, changes in health status. I answered all of them accurately and without elaboration. She typed the answers with the same efficient speed she had entered the room with, and I could see, from the angle of her typing, that she was also reading something on the screen. Something that was generating the periodic quality of careful attention in her face that she was managing to keep mostly neutral. When she got to the physical assessment portion, she asked me to remove my jacket. I did. The scars on my forearms are not dramatic. They are not the kind of thing that invites immediate comment in most contexts. They read from a distance as the incidental marks of a physical life, which is what they are. But up close in a medical examination context, with the training to read what a body's surface record contains, they are something else. Marsh looked at my arms for a moment. She did not say anything about them. She was professional enough not to, but she noted something on the screen and the quality of her attention shifted in a way that was subtle and clear at the same time. She completed the vital checks with the same efficiency she had begun with. She did the mobility assessment, knee range of motion, shoulder rotation, the standard joints. She noted the knee reconstruction. She noted the rehabilitation outcome. She asked about current pain levels, which I answered accurately. When she finished, she said she would review the record and return with any follow-up questions. She left the room. She was gone for 9 minutes, which was longer than the standard pause between assessment and follow-up in a routine physical. I sat on the paper-covered table and looked at the wall and thought about what she was doing, which was almost certainly verifying the classification in my record against the service history that classification implied, because the two things were producing a result in her mind that she was not prepared to accept on the basis of looking at me alone. That was not an unreasonable response. The people who hold the classifications in my service record are not always the people who look like they hold them, and the medical personnel who encounter them in routine clinic settings have legitimate professional reasons to verify what they are reading against what they can see. She came back in without a follow-up question. She said the physician would be in shortly. She left again. I noted the word physician rather than the specific name, which suggested the person coming in was not who had been assigned to the appointment. Something had changed in the 9 minutes she'd been gone. The physician who came in was not on my appointment. I knew this because the intake documentation had listed a Dr. Ferrara for the assessment, and the man who came through the door was not Dr. Ferrara. He was in his early 50s, in uniform, not clinic whites but service dress, which was unusual for an examination context. He introduced himself as Commander Holt. He sat down in the corner chair rather than standing at the screen, which was also unusual. Physicians in routine appointments stand. They move. They reference the screen. A physician who sits down in the chair is changing the register of the conversation. He looked at me with the direct, professional attention of someone who has looked at a file and is now looking at the person the file describes and is running a quiet comparison. I reviewed your record, he said. I wanted to introduce myself because some of the background information is unusual for this clinic's standard patient population. Unusual, I said. The classification is one we don't see often in routine clearance physicals, he said. I wanted to make sure the record was being handled correctly. I said, the record is accurate, he nodded. I believe it, he said. He said it in a specific way, not as validation, but as a statement of assessment. He had looked at what the record said and at the woman in front of him and had arrived at a conclusion. I want to ask you some questions that aren't on the standard intake form with your permission. I said that was fine. Asked about the knee reconstruction, the specific injury event, the type of procedure, the rehabilitation protocol I had been on. He was asking in the way of someone with specific knowledge of the types of injuries that generate specific types of reconstructions, and the questions were more precise than the standard follow-up. He asked about the scars on my forearms. Not invasively, carefully, in the specific way of someone who understands what they are looking at and wants to confirm the reading. I answered accurately. He wrote things down. Then he said, "Your current position is liaison." Yes, you requested the transfer 14 months ago. Yes, before the physical prompted a transition evaluation. I requested it before the mandatory cycle would have evaluated me, I said. The request was voluntary. He looked at me for a moment. Why? He said. It was a direct question, and he asked it without the professional softening that most physicians apply to questions that enter personal territory. I told him the same things I have already written here: the knee, the sustainability assessment, the family consideration. I told him in the same order and with the same precision I would use in any operational debrief. He wrote more things down. Then he said, "There are some anomalies in the prior physical records." The last 2 annual clearances were processed through a different system, one specific to the assignment classification. The transition to standard records created some gaps. He paused. The standard record shows incomplete health history. What kind of incomplete? I asked. The shoulder injury from 4 years ago, he said. The concussive events from the 3rd deployment. He looked at me. Those aren't in the standard record. I absorbed that. They should have been. The records had been processed through the classified system and were supposed to transfer on reassignment. If they had not transferred, my current clearance was based on a health history that was missing 2 significant entries. I wasn't informed of the transfer gap, I said. I know, he said. The system should have flagged it. It didn't. He said it without apology, as a factual statement about a system failure that had produced an outcome and was now being addressed. What does this mean for the clearance? I asked. I need to complete a more thorough assessment before I can sign the clearance form, he said, which means this appointment extends, and depending on what I find, there may be follow-up. He paused. I also need to flag the records transfer issue with the administrative chain, because if the gap exists in your file, it may exist in others. I nodded. He looked at me with the careful, specific look he had since he walked in. Have one more question, he said, and this one is outside the standard intake. I waited. He said, why didn't you flag the records gap yourself? I thought about the answer for a moment before I gave it. I didn't know it existed, I said. I assumed the transfer had been completed correctly. That was true. What was also true, and what I did not say, was that I had spent years in environments where you did not volunteer information about gaps in systems unless someone asked. You answered what was asked. You did not supplement. It was a professional habit, and it had produced an inadvertent consequence in a context where the habit was wrong. He heard the full answer in the partial one. All right, he said. Let's do this correctly. The extended assessment took 2 hours. Holt was thorough, more thorough than the standard clearance physical, and more thorough than I had expected given that the appointment had begun as a routine matter. He worked through the shoulder, the concussive history, the knee. He asked detailed questions about the events that had generated each entry and cross, referenced the answers against the partial records he had. He was building, I understood, the complete picture that the transfer gap had prevented the standard system from having. He was also, I noticed, making decisions in real time about what the complete picture meant for the clearance determination. At the end of the 2 hours, he said he would need a day to complete his assessment and that the clearance form would not be signed until he had. He said it professionally and without apology. I said I understood. I went back to the center. The next morning, I received a call from the clinic's administrative coordinator. She informed me that the records gap had been flagged and was being reviewed by the medical records office, and that the review might take up to 2 weeks. She also said that during the review period, my current clearance status was technically provisional, not suspended, but under a notation that would be visible to anyone running a standard check. I asked what that meant for my current position. She said she would check and call me back. She called back 2 hours later and said that my position required a current clearance and that the provisional status needed to be resolved before the end of the current review cycle, which was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks was manageable. I said so. She said, "There's one other thing." She paused in the way of someone delivering information they were not certain how to deliver. The records gap was escalated to the clinic's medical director. He's reviewed the partial record and he has some concerns about the clearance that are beyond the scope of a standard annual physical. I asked what concerns. The concussive history, she said. 3 events in a 4-year period is above the threshold that standard clearance guidelines flag for further evaluation. I said I was aware of the threshold and that all 3 events had been evaluated and cleared at the time through the classified system. The classified system records aren't available to the medical director through standard access, she said. I understood what she was telling me. The classified records showed clearance at each event. The standard records showed 3 events and no clearance documentation. The medical director was reading the standard record, which looked like 3 unresolved concussive entries, and was applying standard guidelines to that reading. The standard guidelines applied to 3 unresolved concussive entries would generate a recommendation against full clearance. I said, the records need to be pulled from the classified system. That requires a request through the records transfer office, she said. The request has been submitted. The timeline is typically 10 to 15 business days, 3 weeks for the review cycle, 10 to 15 days for the records transfer. The timelines were close enough to be manageable if everything moved efficiently. I said I understood and thanked her. I spent the afternoon preparing the formal request for expedited records transfer. I had to submit it through my chain, which meant routing it through my direct supervisor at the center, a Captain Ellison, who was a competent administrator and who received the request and routed it with the standard note that the matter was pending. 4 days later, I received a call from the records transfer office. They informed me that the expedited request had been received and was in queue, but that the classified records I was requesting required a specific declassification authorization from the originating command before they could be transferred to the standard medical system. The originating command was a unit that no longer existed in its prior form, having been reorganized 14 months ago. The declassification authorization had to come from the new command structure. I asked who in the new command structure held the authorization. The records officer named an office and a rank. I asked how to reach that office. She gave me a contact number. I called the number. I reached an administrative assistant who told me the officer responsible for that authorization was currently deployed and that requests of this nature were being handled on a rolling basis with an estimated response time of 4 to 6 weeks. I put the phone down. I sat at my desk at the Naval Medical Research Center and looked at the window. The 3-week review cycle, the 10 to 15-day records transfer that required an authorization from a deployed officer with a 4 to 6 week response timeline. The timelines no longer fit. My clearance, if nothing changed, would not be resolved before the cycle deadline. That was not a notation. That was a suspension. I made a list. It is what I do when a situation has moved beyond the manageable and entered the territory of the complex but solvable. I make a list of the elements, their dependencies, their contact points, and the available paths through them. It is a habit from environments where the list was a survival tool rather than an organizational preference. The elements were the records gap, which had produced a provisional clearance status. The medical director's concern, which had elevated the matter beyond a standard records transfer. The records transfer, which required a declassification authorization. The authorization, which required a deployed officer with a 4 to 6 week response timeline. The review cycle deadline, which was in 17 days. The available paths were fewer than I would have liked. I could contact the research center's commanding officer and request she intervene to accelerate the authorization timeline. This was possible, but involved asking a senior officer to insert herself into a records process that was technically outside her direct authority. Possible, not clean, not guaranteed to move faster than the existing timeline. I could contact the originating command directly, not the administrative channel that had given me the 4 to 6 week estimate, but the operational chain. I had contacts in that structure from my assignment. The contacts were real. Using them to accelerate a bureaucratic records process was the kind of move that works once and generates friction in the relationship afterward. I noted it as available but costly. I could request a formal medical review board, which would pause the clearance suspension while the full record was being assessed. The review board process was slower than the records transfer, but did not require the deployed officer's authorization. It required 3 signatures from medical personnel with the appropriate clearances to review the classified records. I did not have 3 such personnel in my immediate chain. I was working through the third option when Holt called. He had heard about the records transfer complication. He said he had made some inquiries after the appointment, not about me specifically, but about the records transfer gap issue in general, because he had a clinical interest in making sure the patients he evaluated had complete records. He had found that the gap in my file was not unique. The reorganization of my prior command had produced several incomplete transfers. How many? I asked. At least 8, he said. Possibly more. The office hasn't done a full audit. I thought about 8 people or more, with incomplete medical records generating standard clearance reviews that were reading unresolved entries without access to the documentation that resolved them. Is anyone addressing it systematically? I said. The records office is aware, he said. But the systematic fix requires the same authorization chain that your individual request requires. The deployed officer. He paused. I've submitted a clinical flag to the medical director noting that the concussive entries in your record cannot be evaluated without the classified documentation. I wanted you to know I've done that. I thanked him. One more thing, he said. The Admiral's physical is next week. I waited. Admiral Reeves, he said. He's the command surgeon's senior advisor. He reviews flagged cases when the medical director escalates them. He paused. Your case is flagged. I understood what he was telling me without him having to say it directly. The Admiral would review my case. The Admiral would see the standard record, 3 concussive events, incomplete history, provisional clearance, pending transfer. What the Admiral would not see unless something changed was the classified record. Is there a way to ensure the classified documentation is available for the review? I asked. Formally, no, he said. The authorization chain is what it is. He paused. Informally, if someone with access to the classified system could provide a summary of the clearance outcomes at each event, and if that summary were submitted as a clinical addendum to the file, the Admiral would have it in front of him. Would a clinical addendum from the originating unit's medical officer carry weight? I asked. Yes, he said. I had one contact in the originating unit's former medical chain who was not deployed. A chief petty officer who had been the senior medical coordinator during my last 2 years of the assignment and who had processed the clearances at each of the 3 concussive events. I called him that evening. He answered. I explained the situation. He was quiet for a moment and then said, I can write a summary. It won't be a formal records transfer, but it'll be accurate and it'll have my name and qualification on it. That's what I need, I said. He said he would have it to me in 2 days. I made a note on my list. The path was not clean, but it was there. And there were 17 days and things were moving and the Admiral's review was in 7. The addendum arrived in 3 days, not 2. The chief had been thorough, more thorough than I asked him to be, which was a function of who he was and how he understood what the document needed to do. He had written 3 pages. Each concussive event was documented with the date, the circumstances, the assessment protocol, the outcome determination, and the specific clearance language that had been applied. He had included his qualification credentials and his contact information. He had formatted it correctly for clinical addendum submission. I read it carefully. It was accurate. It was complete. It was the document that the standard record was missing. I submitted it to Holt the morning of the 4th day. Holt acknowledged receipt and said he would forward it to the medical director's office with a note explaining the context. On the 5th day, the medical director's office returned the addendum. Not to me, to Holt, with a notation that materials from non-standard sources could not be accepted as clinical record supplements without formal authorization from the records transfer office, which required the deployed officer's authorization. We were back to the circle. I sat with this for a morning and then I did something I had been avoiding. I called my prior commanding officer, not the reorganized command, the man himself. He had retired 8 months after the reorganization, which meant he was no longer in the chain that controlled the authorization. But he had held that authority when my records were generated, and his knowledge of the record was direct and unmediated. He answered on the 2nd ring. I explained the situation. He listened in the way that certain senior military figures listen, completely, without interruption, with the quality of someone whose attention is a tool that has been refined for decades. When I finished, he said, What do you need? I told him about the Admiral's review. He was quiet for a moment. Reeves, he said, not a question. You know him, I said. From a prior joint assignment, he said. Long enough ago that I would not characterize us as current contacts, but I can make a call. I said, I don't want to use your relationship to pressure the review. You're not asking me to pressure it, he said. You're asking me to ensure the reviewer has accurate information. That's not the same thing. I thought about that distinction. It was real and he was drawing it correctly. Tell me exactly what information the review is missing, he said. I told him. He said, I'll make the call this afternoon. On the 6th day, the day before the Admiral's review, Holt called me. The medical director received a call, he said. He did not say from whom and I did not ask. The classified records have been flagged for expedited transfer through a separate authorization channel that I wasn't aware existed. He paused. I don't know all the details of how that happened, but the transfer is processing. The records should be in the system before the Admiral's appointment. I said, should be. Should be, he confirmed. I'm not guaranteeing it. But the trajectory is different than it was yesterday. On the morning of the review, I was at my desk at the center when the call came in from the records office. The transfer had completed at 6:47 that morning. The full classified record was in the system. All 3 concussive events showed resolution. The medical director had reviewed the complete record and had updated the flagged case notation. I put the phone down. Outside the window, the morning was ordinary, the specific ordinary of a Wednesday in late September, with the particular quality of light that comes in the weeks when the angle is changing. I had been at this desk for 14 months. I knew the window's light at every hour. I did not feel relief exactly. I felt the specific state of a system resolving correctly after a period in which the resolution had been non-obvious. It is not the same as relief. It has less warmth to it. The Admiral's review was at 10. I was not in the room. I was not entitled to be in the room. The review was administrative, not clinical, and the parties in the room were the medical director, Holt, and the Admiral. I found out what happened from Holt that afternoon. The Admiral had reviewed the complete record, including the newly transferred classified documentation. He had asked the medical director several questions about the transfer gap, how it had occurred, how many other cases were affected, what the systematic fix looked like. The medical director had answered with the information available to him and had acknowledged that the audit of affected cases was incomplete. The Admiral had requested a full audit of all records gaps produced by the command reorganization. He had also signed my clearance form. Holt said the Admiral had asked one question about the case that was not about the records or the process. He had asked whether the individual had been informed that the gap existed. The medical director had said no. The Admiral had said that was the first thing that needed to change. The call I had not expected came 2 days after the clearance was signed. It was from the Admiral's office, not the Admiral himself, but his administrative assistant, requesting that I come in for a brief meeting at my earliest convenience. The phrasing was polite and non-specific. Earliest convenience meant as soon as possible. I said I could come the next morning. The office was in the administrative building adjacent to the clinic. It had the quality that senior military offices have, functional, not decorated, organized in a way that communicates that the work is the point. Admiral Reeves was in his late 50s, with the physical economy of someone who had maintained a high standard throughout a long career and had not let the administrative years change that. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited until I sat before he spoke. He said, "I've been in the Navy for 32 years. I've reviewed hundreds of medical cases. The situation with your records is not unique, but the specific way it played out, the combination of the records gap, the transfer timeline, the standard system reading the partial history and generating the wrong picture, that's a failure I want to understand." I said, "I should have verified the transfer when I was reassigned." He looked at me. "Why didn't you?" I gave him the honest answer, the one I had partially given Holt in the examination room. The professional habit of not supplementing what wasn't asked for. The assumption that a transfer completed through the official channel was completed correctly. He was quiet for a moment. "That habit makes sense in the context you developed it in," he said. "It's the wrong habit here." "I know that now," I said. "You knew it before," he said. "Or you would have known it if you had applied the same standard to yourself that you would apply to a patient record." That was accurate, and it was stated without cruelty, which made it land more cleanly than a crueler version would have. I thought about what he was saying. I had spent years reviewing other people's records, identifying gaps, flagging incomplete histories, insisting on complete documentation for the patients in the research data I worked with. I had not applied the same scrutiny to my own record. The professional habit and the professional expertise had existed in separate compartments that had not communicated. "The audit I've requested," he said, "is going to find other cases like yours, people who were reassigned during the reorganization, whose records transferred with gaps, who are being evaluated against incomplete histories." He paused. "In some of those cases, the evaluation may have already produced incorrect outcomes." I understood what that meant. Someone whose classified clearance at a concussive event was not in their standard record had possibly been evaluated as having 3 unresolved events rather than 3 resolved ones. A clearance may have been denied or restricted on the basis of a record that was missing the documentation that would have reversed the determination. "How many?" I said. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's what the audit will tell us." He looked at me with the direct, considered quality he had had since I walked in. "Your prior commanding officer made a call on your behalf," he said. "Yes," I said. "He volunteered." "He described your service record briefly," the Admiral said. "He was concise, which I appreciated. He said what mattered and stopped." I nodded. The Admiral looked at my arms briefly, the way Holt had looked at them in the clinic, with the specific look of someone reading a surface accurately. "The scars on your forearms," he said. "I saw the medical notes." I said nothing. "The classified record includes a notation from your unit's commanding officer at the time," he said, "about a specific incident during your third deployment. I'm not going to ask you about it. I read what was in the record and I understand what it means." I sat with that. The notation he was referring to was from 7 years ago. It was a single paragraph in a classified record that I had not thought about in a long time, or had thought about in the specific way that things from operational contexts get thought about, which is sideways and briefly and not for long. He said, "The work you did was real and it mattered, and the record reflects it accurately. What the standard system presented to my office was a picture that had nothing to do with the actual picture. And you navigated the correction of that gap with the same precision you apparently bring to everything else." He paused. "I'm not saying this to make you feel recognized," he said. "I'm saying it because I want you to understand the full scope of what the audit is going to find. It's not just a records management problem. It's a situation in which real service, accurately recorded in one system, is invisible in another. And the people affected by that invisibility deserve to know it's being corrected." I looked at him. "Yes, sir," I said. That was the only available response. And it was, for the first time in several weeks, entirely sufficient. The audit results came in over the following 3 weeks. I was not part of the audit process. I was informed of its existence and its general parameters, and I received a notification when my own file had been formally closed. The provisional notation removed, the complete record consolidated, the clearance confirmed in full. The notification came in a standard administrative format, a brief document, a signature, a date. I read it and filed it. What I learned about the broader audit came through Holt, who had been designated as the clinical lead for the review of affected cases, and who contacted me twice during the process, once to ask a clarifying question about the classification system used during the prior command's operational period, and once to tell me the preliminary scope. 14 cases. 14 individuals whose records had transferred with gaps during the reorganization. Of the 14, 6 had already completed standard clearance reviews based on incomplete records. 3 of those 6 had received clearance determinations that the complete record did not support, meaning the determination had been made on the basis of missing information, and the missing information, once incorporated, would have produced a different result. Not necessarily a different outcome in terms of clearance denial. In 2 of the 3 cases, the complete record still produced a clearance. But the process had been wrong, which meant the record was wrong, which meant the people involved had been operating under a clearance that had not been correctly generated. In the 3rd case, a clearance had been denied on the basis of an incomplete record that, fully assembled, would have resulted in a provisional clearance pending further assessment. Not a clean approval, but not a denial. The individual had not appealed the denial. They had left the service on the basis of a determination that had been wrong. I read this in Holt's summary and sat with it. One person, one wrong determination, not malicious. The system had operated as designed, the design had failed. The person had done nothing wrong, the record had been wrong, they were out of the Navy. The Admiral, when informed of this specific case, requested a formal review of the discharge determination through the Navy's Board for Correction of Naval Records. The request was filed correctly with the complete record attached. The process would take time, these processes always take time. The outcome was not guaranteed. But the process had been initiated, and the correct record was now in the system, and the initiation was documented. Commander Holt's clinical flag, the one he had submitted to the medical director noting that the concussive entries in my record could not be evaluated without the classified documentation, was incorporated into a revised protocol for handling records from the reorganized command. Any subsequent clearance review involving personnel from that command would now require verification of records transfer completion before evaluation. It was a small protocol change. It would affect a limited population. In the institutional scale of a military medical system, it was a footnote. But the 14 cases that had been identified, and the 1 discharge that had been triggered by an incomplete record, and the 6 evaluations that had been completed on wrong information, those were now in the institutional record. They had names and dates and case numbers. They would be there for the next review cycle, and the one after, as evidence of what happens when systems fail in specific ways that are not visible from inside the standard operating process. I went back to my desk at the research center. I went back to reviewing case files and attending briefings and translating between clinical language and operational language in both directions. The work was the same. The appointment on my calendar for the following year's physical was already in the system. I thought about the woman who had left the Navy on the basis of a wrong determination. I did not know her name. The audit summary was anonymized at my level. I did not know what she had been doing, or what the service had been to her, or what she had gone back to. I only knew that the record had been wrong, and that she had not known it was wrong, and that the process to correct it had been started because a routine physical had been scheduled, and an intake nurse had looked at a form and thought there was a system error, and a physician had walked into an examination room and looked at someone's arms and decided the full picture needed to be assembled. That chain of small events, that specific chain. My clearance renewed on the 31st day. The notification came in the same format as all the others, brief, signed, dated. I read it and put it in the file and went back to work. Holt called once more several weeks after the audit concluded. Not about my case. About a question he had for the research data I worked with, something about injury sequencing in a population I had access to through the center's studies. I answered the question. Before he ended the call, he said, "The board submitted the correction request for the discharge case." "I know," I said. "I received the notification." "The timeline is long," he said. "I know that too," I said. He said, "I wanted you to know it moved." I said I appreciated that. I have thought in the weeks since about the intake nurse at the clinic, the one who looked at my form and decided there was a system error. She was not wrong to think there was an error. In the standard world, the classification in the form produced a result that looked like an error because the standard world does not routinely contain people with that classification arriving for routine annual physicals. She processed what she saw with the tools she had. She was wrong about the error, but she was not wrong to look. The looking produced Holt's involvement, which produced the extended assessment, which produced the discovery of the transfer gap, which produced the audit, which produced 14 cases identified, which produced one correction request for one person whose discharge was generated by a wrong determination. That is the whole chain. I did not set it in motion deliberately. I came in for a physical. I answered the questions accurately. I did not volunteer what was not asked for, and then I was asked, and I answered. The Admiral saw the scars and read them correctly. The record was made complete. Somewhere a wrong determination is being reviewed. That is not everything. But it is the full shape of what was available, and it was used correctly, and the chain of it is in the record now. That has to mean something.